Good evening. It's great to see you all here. I'm really pleased to have you. I'm Paul Fanlon, publisher of the Capital Times, and on behalf of all of us at the Capital Times, I'd like to welcome you to this session, which is part of our 7th annual Cap Times Idea Fest. We think we have our strongest lineup yet this year, and tonight is part of it. So thank you. Thanks for that. We're delighted to present tonight Keith Ellison, the Attorney General of Minnesota, on our stage. And he'll be in conversation with John Nichols, who, as many of you know, is the associate editor of the Capital Times and a longtime connection of Keith's, and it'll be a great conversation. In 2006, Keith was the first Muslim elected to Congress, and John has a great column around Keith's faith and political philosophy that you can find on captimes.com, so I recommend that to you. Part of my role is to thank our sponsors, which I'm going to do for a couple of minutes now. Our presenting sponsor again this year, and we're very grateful for them, is Epic Systems, and our other major sponsors include Exact Sciences and HealthX Ventures. Our session sponsor tonight is the Madison Community Foundation. We'd like to thank them. Other sponsors include Madison Gas and Electric, Alliant Energy, Ascendium Education Group, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Godfrey Kahn Law, Kessenix, the University Research Park, the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Cargo Coffee, Leopold's Books, Bar, Cafe. Leopold's is selling Keith's books afterwards, and he'll be autographing copies back behind the theater. Madison College, Forward Theater, and Youngblood Beer Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, and Civic Media. Just a second on the Capital Times. When you think of the Cap Times, we hope you see us as an essential part of the fabric of Madison, locally owned and locally run, and that you appreciate our news and cultural coverage, our opinions, and our history of philanthropy that many of you know has supported causes touching on racial and social justice for decades in this community. So if you're not already, we'd love you to consider becoming a Cap Times member. You can learn more at captimes.com. So tonight's program. Keith was elected Attorney General of Minnesota in 2018, and in that role has expanded the office's strong tradition of consumer protection, including by fighting profiteering and illegal evictions during the pandemic. He has been a national leader on criminal justice reform and was the lead prosecutor after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, heading the team that successfully convicted former police officer Derek Chauvin of second-degree murder. Before becoming Attorney General, Keith was a 6-term member of the U.S. House of Representatives, where he championed consumer, worker, environmental, and civil rights protections. He earned his law degree from the University of Minnesota in 1990 and is the father of 4 adult children. Keith will be discussing his new book, which, as I mentioned, is for sale, Break the Wheel, Ending the Cycle of Police Violence, with John tonight. You know, one of the goals of Cap Times Idea Fest is to bring speakers to Madison who are on the leading edge of the most consequential national conversations we can have. Bernie Sanders on Friday night is certainly one of those people, as is Adam Kinzinger on Saturday night. And Keith Ellison also perfectly fits that definition. So with that, would you welcome Keith and John to our stage?
We're told to be careful with our microphones and get them close to us.
You got it.
All right.
How's everybody doing? All right.
We can't see you, so we know you're beautiful. Thanks to Paul. He's off stage now, but Paul Fanlon, this was his idea to do Idea Fest, and it has grown and grown and proven to be an incredibly powerful force in this town. And Keith, you should know that everything's videotaped, and the real life of Ideas Fest is actually through the years and the years going forward, because all of this tends to be viewed by many folks, including folks who are at home now watching us. So,
oh, fantastic.
pleasure to have Keith Ellison with us. And let me begin with a quick story, and that was of on the weekend after George Floyd was murdered. I was at home here in Madison, and things were blowing up all over, right? The whole world was on edge, and I knew, as everybody did, that at some point there was going to be the question of whether we were going to try and get justice, whether there would be an opportunity, because so many times it had been thwarted in so many circumstances, and there had been so much evidence that that justice couldn't be achieved. And I called Keith Ellison at home. We have known each other for a ridiculously long time, and we ended up talking for a good hour or so about this all.
As we often do.
As we often do. And this was before Keith had taken on the case, before he ended up being responsible for it. And what was so powerful about that was that Keith Ellison put everything in perspective. He did talk about what had happened with George Floyd, but he also talked about the whole of our history, going back 400 years, and he talked about how important it was that justice be achieved in this moment. And remarkably enough, within the next few days, he was put at the center of that struggle to achieve justice, and he actually did it. Ladies and gentlemen, you are in the company of one of the most epic lawyers and political figures.
Thanks, John.
So before we go to the book, and we're going to talk about that quite a bit, but I wanted to begin by going back to when we first got to know each other.
Sure.
And you almost certainly don't remember this, but I do. And it was via Paul Wellstone.
Love that guy. Love that guy.
And Paul Wellstone said to me, there is a young guy coming up here in Minnesota who's going to do some stuff. And I was at an event speaking up there, and you popped in, and I was introduced to you, and you were so full of energy and excitement about, at that point, getting into the state legislature.
That's right. I was running for state legislature for the first time.
In the year that Paul died.
Sure.
And I want to begin by reminding people that in addition to being Attorney General, you were a congressman for a substantial amount of time, member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, in fact, leader of the Congressional Progressive Caucus with some guy that these people won't know named Mark Pocan.
Hey, he's all right. Let's hear from Mark Pocan, everybody. That's right.
And so you had this career in Washington, and you were very close to Bernie Sanders. I think the first or second member of Congress to endorse Bernie Sanders for President of the United States back in 2015. And so your path in Washington was very clear. But you decided at a point when you could have easily stayed in D.C. that you wanted to come back to Minnesota and become the Attorney General of Minnesota. Tell us about that decision as it leads us into everything else we'll be talking about tonight.
Yeah, well, it took a lot
Bring that microphone a little bit up.
Can you guys hear me in the back? Well, honestly, that decision took me by surprise. Our Attorney General was someone named Lori Swanson, and she had been Attorney General for about 12 years. And on a Saturday, we had what we call the Democratic Party in Minnesota, the DFL. Some of y'all know about it. As your next door neighbor, I'm sure you're familiar with that. And Lori decided within a weekend, when she was running for re-election, to suddenly on the stage withdraw and launch her campaign for governor. That was on a Saturday. By that Tuesday, I had to decide, what are you going to do? And I filed to run for Attorney General. And the reason really is because it is important, very important, to have legislators write good laws. It's also important to enforce those laws. And there just had been a myriad of things that I just wanted to see actually happen. And for example, wage theft is a massive problem in our country. Working people having their wages just taken away by people who are in a position who are supposed to pay them and owe them. And I help, bring forth appropriation bills saying that anybody who's caught, engaging in wage theft can't get a federal contract. And believe it or not, that got to be a contested big fight during the appropriation season. And so one of the first, I wanted to set up a wage theft unit, which we have done. I wanted to sue companies who were violating our antitrust laws around prescription drugs. We're resolving right now a case against insulin manufacturers who have been sticking it to people for literally decades over something that was made for, the patent was sold to University of Toronto for $1, right? And so I thought we're going to enforce some laws here, and we're going to hold some people accountable, and we're going to make the law live by enforcing it. And I thought that's where I could bring my best value. So I said bye-bye to my pals in Congress, and the rest is history.
But it's very uncommon for somebody to leave Congress and go to a state office.
Yeah.
For a whole bunch of reasons.
Some people thought it was like going from the majors to the AAA.
Really?
They thought so. I don't think so. In fact, in many ways, the state is where the action is. The districts that members of Congress run in are written at the state. Nobody needs to tell a Wisconsinite that. The voting qualifications, whether you can do same-day voter registration, whether felons can vote, whether you can do vote by mail, these are all state matters. Nowadays, your right to reproductive freedom is at the state level, right? So much of criminal justice law is state. I mean, the state really is an incredibly important place to be active. And as AG, you're not confined to your own state. I work with Josh Call all the time on things that are of concern to Minnesota and Wisconsin. And we work nationally quite a lot on whether it be opioids or protecting the Affordable Care Act or suing the federal government for throttling the mails when the U.S. Postal Service was being manipulated by number 45 and his minion. So for those reasons, I mean, I would never turn back. I've never regretted it. And in fact, I've been called to Congress at least 2 times to testify about what state AGs can do to deliver good outcomes for Americans all over the country.
And yeah, you can applaud that. Keith and I have known each other for a very long time. I've found he has no aversion to applause whatsoever. So you went into the state, but you came into this position as a first in many ways, right? I don't think Minnesota had a black attorney general before.
No, we hadn't had anybody in statewide office who was not Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
The whole bit,
yeah.
Norwegian.
You're right.
And
we had Norwegians or Swedes, one of the two. Those.
Yeah, I realize that, and it was not a pretty political divide. Yeah. But and also the first Muslim.
Yeah. True.
And so you came into this office, and often when you're the first, there's a pressure on you to be cautious, right? To not push limits. You chose to go a different route. You came into the Attorney General's office, and long before the murder of George Floyd, you started already working on police violence issues.
Oh, yeah.
In the office. That's a significant reality because it sets up what we'll talk about
Sure.
as regards the book.
Well, right when I got elected, I reached out to the Commissioner of Public Safety and said, we need to have a task force on reducing deadly force encounters with police. And we're going to have a comprehensive look at it. We're going to have police, law enforcement on the task force. But we're also going to have Black Lives Matter, ACLU, NAACP, and we're going to have rural police officers. We're going to have sheriffs. We're going to have urban cops. We're going to have everybody who has a stake in this. And we're going to do it outside the context of a crisis, right? Because usually when these task force gets set up, it's after Ferguson, it's after Rodney King, it's after some sort of catastrophic, tragic event, and we're just gonna do it. We're gonna do it now while everybody's pretty calm, and we can maybe find something that we can agree on. And we concluded our work in February, March 2020, months before.
A couple months before.
Months before, yeah, just a few weeks before, if you can count it that way, maybe 12 weeks before. And we came up with a lot of really good recommendations. And we, before we really implemented any of them, we had the crisis of George Floyd.
Before we talk about that, two things I want to emphasize here. Number one, you put a big emphasis on police violence in rural areas.
Right.
Because if I'm right from our conversations, you wanted to build a coalition of people that recognized that, yes, this is an urban challenge, but this is also a challenge out on country roads and in small towns.
Absolutely true. Let me tell you, in Minnesota, and I bet you it's true in Wisconsin too, if you look at all of the officer-involved deaths, in Minnesota at least, a majority of them were in greater Minnesota.
Which is, just to translate for these folks, that's the Twin Cities.
Right. Greater Minnesota is outside of the Twin Cities. So the rural areas, right? And we also found, relatedly, that at least a third, and arguably even higher than that, were people in the midst of a mental health crisis, right? And so, we train officers to do a lot of things, but dealing with people in mental health crisis generally is outside of their scope of expertise, right? And certainly in rural communities, we don't think of this issue as placed where these things happen. But I guarantee you, we had a lot of officers come in and talk about, look, we'd like more training, but if you have training for our department, there's 5 of us. If one of us is in training, you've just reduced our force by 20% that day, right? And so we're not like Minneapolis, which has 800 police officers. So this is not a one-size-fits-all kind of scenario. There are some communities where there's, quite honestly, a degree of hostility between certain communities and the police department. And there's other communities that really embrace their department and won't cotton any critique of that department, right? And so it really is a thing that takes some care to understand. And generalizations won't serve you well if you're trying to solve this problem. But there are some themes that are consistent that I'm sure we're going to talk about in a little while.
One other aspect of this too is that you had experience in this area beyond just, it wasn't just theoretical for you.
Right, absolutely. Well, turns out a lot. I mean, I remember when I was maybe 3.5, 4 years old as a kid in Detroit, on my tippy toes looking out of the window and seeing military vehicles going by and hearing my parents talk about the riot in Detroit.
1967.
Yeah, so I actually have a memory of this. And, and my mother explained, this involves the police and some people who were at a nightclub and things got really bad. And then later on as an adult, I'm practicing law, and it was, on the one hand, we have great officers who really bring wonderful service to the community, but we often heard that there were some, and the names would repeat who, were kind of a real problem. And the problem with these folks repeating is that the department leadership would never seem to get around to disciplining these guys, despite numbers of complaints. So you end up with this true 80-20 problem. 80% never having a single complaint, 20% having tons of complaints. And yet, we understand that organizations work like that. The real problem is the impunity on that 20%. Somebody's got to say, not around here. And we didn't see that, not in Minneapolis. Interestingly enough, in St. Paul, though, that's a big contrast. And St. Paul has this historical, much better relationship between police and community. interesting thing about it, and I'm not trying to say it's nirvana by any means, but I will tell you that the clearance rate on homicides and auto thefts in St. Paul is dramatically higher than Minneapolis. Are these things related? The difficulty and the very, the caustic relationship between police and community in Minneapolis and the low clearance rate on homicide, are those things related? I would suggest yes. I would suggest yes. I would say that if people fear, distrust, or dislike the guardians who are responsible for their safety, then they will not share information. They will not tell people what's going on. They will not cooperate with subpoenas, and you will have a lot of unsolved crime. So it turns out that dealing with chronically bad officers actually is a crime reduction strategy.
You know, all the time I've known you, you've always been one of the most pro-union people I've ever met.
I am.
We were even today talking about the UAW being on strike and solidarity with those who were out. But you also recognized early on that you had to talk about the police unions.
Yeah.
And particularly the police union in Minneapolis.
Yeah. Here's just a little quickie story about, I could tell you a lot of stories. One of them involves you guys here in Wisconsin. Maybe I'll start there.
Why don't you?
So, 2 Minneapolis police officers are at the Green Bay Packers Vikings game in Lambeau. You can smell the tension already. And these guys are drinking too much, disorderly, getting into fights, but they're in civilian clothes. They get arrested. They tell the Green Bay department, "Hey, we're cops. What are you doing arresting us?" "Well, you're breaking the law." "Come on, man, you do a brother cop a break." "No, you're arrested in here." Now, walking into the department, as they're walking into the department, there is a camera. On that camera, they are being filmed. They don't know it. And they are using homophobic expletives regarding the chief of police in Minneapolis, who was a lesbian woman named Renee Harto. And they're saying this D, fill in the blank, she's really gonna bust our male anatomy because once she finds out about this, boy, we're gonna be in trouble because that D, she hates men anyway, and all this kind of talk. Mm-hmm. So this is all on tape. So like the Green Bay department calls Minneapolis and say, "We got your boys here, and we're not dropping the charges." Yes, they're in trouble. Now they were all low-level things, disorderly conduct, stuff like that. Anyway, the head of the union, who never saw police misconduct ever, didn't exist in his mind, says, I don't know what you two guys want from me. You're busted. You're insulting the chief on video. What do you want from me? You're out. And they were out. Mm-hmm. Here's where the story picks up. A guy named Bob Kroll says, Delmonico, the prior president, didn't protect our boys, runs for president of the union, wins, and becomes the new head of the police union.
In Minneapolis.
In Minneapolis, within weeks. He's also a lieutenant. He's teaching a course, and only cops are in the room. No one else is in the room, only cops. And he says, the people in Minneapolis are pretty dumb. We're at war with the terrorists, and they just elected one to Congress.
That would be...
So an officer raises her hand and says, "Are you calling Congressman Ellison a terrorist because of his religion?" And the answer was, "Well, he is one of them." And then his answer was, "I was only kidding. You took me out of context. I didn't say it, but if I did, I didn't really mean it." Anyway, he gets under investigation for this comment. And the chief of police, after investigating this comment, ends up having to apologize to me publicly. So that is the police union chief when, the tragedies in Minneapolis unfold that we're talking about tonight.
Yeah.
It's important to know that Derek Chauvin had 18 excessive force complaints But if you rank the officer with the most complaints to the one with the least, he's not even in the top 10. We're talking about a systematic disregard of violation of department rules and maybe the law. You're talking about impunity. If you have that, you tell the good officers who are there to protect people that no good you do is going to be recognized, really. And you tell the bad ones nothing bad you do is going to be sanctioned. And so you have utter confusion. And so, from a citizen standpoint, they don't know who's who. They just know somebody in blue just knocked my head in, called me a foul name, whatever, or kill someone unjustifiably, or maybe justifiably. But how do we know? Because the reputation is so bad, but even when things are done within the law, they're suspected as not being within the law. And so, I've had people say, well, you prosecuting Chauvin, that's anti-cop. I'm like, absolutely, it's pro-cop, because if you want to do the job right, do you really want to be partners with this guy who's jumping out of a car, looking to crack a head before they're even asking a question? And on the issue of asking questions, George Floyd was never asked, did you know this bill was fake? He was never asked that question. To this day. That seems kind of basic to me. Anyway, thanks for asking that.
So all of this
that was all about the police union, sorry.
That's okay. This is all, I did this all because this is the context in which your phone rang and Keith's book is fantastic, by the way. It is in many ways a diary of a struggle for justice. And at 4:40 in the morning on, I hope I'm right, is it?
May 26th?
May 26th. 4:40 in the morning, you got
We want folks to know what we're talking about here.
Makes a fine holiday gift, too, by the way. But 4:40 in the morning on May 26th, 2020, you're asleep.
Yeah.
Presumably. You don't get up till 4:48 or something like that.
Something like that.
And your phone rings. It's one of your aides.
Yep.
And saying, have you seen the video, basically?
That's right.
Tell us about that moment.
Well, my phone, my alarm is set at like 4:45. Just for context, in my religion, you have to do a prayer before the sun comes up. So I often go right back to bed, But I did get up at 4:45 when the alarm goes off, and my alarm is set to Hamilton, right? So the same song goes on every morning. And so I grab the phone, I look at the face of it, and the text is, "You must watch this now." So I touch the screen, and this video begins to unfold. And you see this man whose neck is under the knee of someone in a uniform. And he's yelling, "I can't breathe. Mama, I can't breathe. Mama, help." And his words get spaced further from each other, and his words get thicker until he's not yelling anything anymore. And then the people assembled on the corner began to yell, "Check his pulse. He's not breathing. He's not resisting." And they begin to get more alarmed and escalated, and they get more animated. And you can see that it is a multiracial group assembled. There's a white woman who's a firefighter. There's a young black man who is a mixed martial arts fighter. There is a 9-year-old kid that has a T-shirt that says "love" on it. You see 2 young white teenagers, 17-year-old girls. You see a black teenager. You see an old man of 60, 8, 9 years old. His name ends up being Charles McMillan. And I can't believe how long this is going on. I can't figure out why he won't just get up. I can't figure out why even though his hands were cuffed behind his back, you wouldn't just get off the man or turn him on his side. But then I watch it again, and I watch it again, and I go to my wife and I say, "Honey, you got to see this." And she goes, "What is it?" And I'm like, this guy is being killed on this video. She says, I don't want to see that. I don't want to see that. My wife's from Colombia. This is a country that had 65 years of civil war. She's seen narco violence. She's seen government violence. She's seen paramilitary violence. She's like, thank you, no thank you. I'll take your word for it. But I got to keep watching it. And all I can remember is things that I've seen, experiences that I've had, and I begin to notice that corner. I notice the street. I notice where it is, and I remember that 2 blocks south of that corner, which is on, some of you all know Minneapolis, 38th in Chicago, 2 blocks south of that, 36th in Chicago, in 1998, I took a civil rights case and sued a police officer for shooting my client in the back who survived. And I think of myself as a pretty decent lawyer. My colleagues were pretty good lawyers. We put a lot of money into that case, experts, transcripts, everything. And the jury came back 0 for our side. The city wouldn't give us a penny. They never even made us an offer. And they said, well, it was dark, and the officer thought he was going to turn quickly and didn't know. And so I knew this area, and those memories flooded back. And then I watched it again. And then I called Keon, who's my 26-year-old outreach guy, and said, you got to pull the team together. We've got to talk about this. That was 8 a.m. when everybody popped on the Zoom. And we began to just say, what do we know? Turns out that Keon, is actually the one. He didn't, of course, have anything to do with taking the video, but he did upload it.
He literally was, it was a young woman who took the video.
Yeah.
Very courageous young woman.
And I dedicated the book to her.
Yeah.
And 17-year-old Darnella Frazier. And she actually was recognized by Pulitzer for that video. And we began to go through it. Who was he? George Floyd. He's from Houston. He moved to Minnesota to try to get his life together. What was this all about? It's about a fake $20 bill. The store said, look, we weren't trying to get him in trouble. We just wanted to know where the 20 is from so we can go ask the person who gave it to him. The store owner never accused him. And he was never asked. And I just remember that early that morning, looking at that screen, feeling the tears roll down my nose crease, fall onto the screen. And I was like, my goodness. It brought me back to my childhood. It brought me back to the Lawrence Miles case, which was in 1998. And it brought me back to a series of other things. And it brought me back to Rodney King. And I thought to myself, what is going to happen here? I knew that if I was waking up to it, everybody else was going to be doing the same. And I knew that people would be in the streets over this. I knew we also had to be a part of the solution, especially since we just resolved that task force just a few weeks before. I didn't know what role we were going to play, but I knew that if you believe that people are called to do things, I felt that we were. I felt that I was. So, but I didn't know what role we were going to play.
And in fact, this was supposed to be a case that went through a county prosecutor.
Exactly.
That's how it works.
In Minnesota, jurisdiction over a crime is in the hands of the prosecutor in the district that it occurs in. So it would have been the Hennepin County prosecutor's case. And there's a story about how that at the time there was a fellow by the name of Mike Freeman. And Mike,
a prominent political figure in the state.
well, his dad was the governor.
Yeah.
And so everybody knows the name Freeman in Minnesota. Orville Freeman not only was the governor of Minnesota, but it was also like the Secretary of Agriculture. And I was about to say transportation. So
that would not have been right.
That would have been wrong. But here's the thing. Mike is a truly awesome guy, in my opinion. But he had run into some trouble with community because there had been some cases that involved in custody deaths involving officers that were not charged out or were no bill of indictment, and a lot of people felt there should have been other action. And one of them that happened only a few years before involved a guy named Jamar Clark, and witnesses on the scene say that he was executed, and yet there was DNA from Jamar Clark on the holster of the officer's belt. And I know that that does not mean that Jamar Clark necessarily was grabbing for the gun, because you have such thing as transferred and there's perspiration. There's a lot of ways it could get there. But it is also quite plausible that he did grab for the officer's gun, and the officer said he grabbed for the gun, and people on the scene said that's not what happened. But that right there is reasonable doubt. So Mike did not charge that case out. And yet people protested and were very angry with him.
And as I remember in this moment that as people got beyond the initial shock of the video,
Right.
and that took some time.
Yeah.
Because it was so overwhelming. Then there was this immediate, or relatively immediate, question of, is this the right person to prosecute this case?
People did raise that issue. And I was on the phone with Mike right away saying, look, man, I'm at your service. You want me to help you? And whatever you need, whatever advice you need. At that time, there was no conversation about me being on the case. I was just a friend supporting somebody who had something drop in their lap, which is pretty serious. Mm-hmm. But then community began to call for, they began to question whether this was the right case for this office. And then there was a Thursday, and remember this, so the George Floyd's killed on Memorial Day. The video hits early morning the following day. Well, then Wednesday happens. Then Thursday there's a press conference, involves the U.S. Attorney and Mike Freeman. And so look, this story was the story. There wasn't really any other. This was dominating the airwaves, excuse me. And so the press was hungry for anything. So apparently, Freeman and the U.S. attorney, who had been talking to the United States Attorney General about a potential all-inclusive agreement to just resolve the case.
This was Donald Trump's Attorney General.
Yep, this is Bill Barr. Mm-hmm. And look, I'm not here to alibi anybody. As you know, I'm a Bernie Sanders liberal, but the truth is Bill Barr thought that this was a horrendous case and wanted something done about it. That's just being honest and true and fair.
It's good.
And so the deal that they were trying to construct, Barr said no, apparently. And so now they still have this press conference because they think they're going to announce something, but now they have nothing to announce. So instead of saying press conference is off, they go out there and do and say, well, we just want to tell everybody that we're working as hard as we can, and hopefully if you have information, call us. So then Freeman goes out there and says, well, yeah, we're still reviewing the case, and says, we've got a lot of information in, and some of it is not consistent with a charge. And even what he meant was, the medical examiner was saying that he had fentanyl. There's all kinds of in the system. There's all kind of stuff like that. And he, I think, in the excitement, he didn't have a script, misspoke, and the moment was so charged.
That's right.
That that quote got grabbed and ran. And that night, and I'm not blaming anyone, and it's unprovable why, but that night the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis is in flames. The crowd surges. There's the largest assembled group I have ever seen in Minneapolis is just all over Lake Street, Lake Street.
Yeah.
And there's just like, there's like, I bet you, I don't know, there's 30,000 people right there. And you see fires going on. And folks, it was very eerie and weird and strange. And I think Minneapolis had a sense of itself that kind of thing could not happen there. Of course, they were wrong. Why? Because in 1920, they burned up the precinct in Duluth, Minnesota, when they accused 3 black men of rape of somebody who was never even raped, and broke into the jail, burned it down, and strung those 3 men up to a light pole.
Lynched him.
So it's not like, oh, us Minnesotans would never burn a precinct. I mean, we done it, you know. But 2020, basically 100 years later, here we are. And that day, Mike said, I need you to partner with me on this case. And I said, of course. And I got a call from some friends who really, like you and others, you know, these are folks who are dear friends of mine, clearly care about me, and some of them have fantasies of me doing some other kind of political job. And they're like, do not take this case, Keith. Don't take this case.
I want to emphasize that I did not tell you not to.
You didn't do that.
No. Yeah.
You didn't do that. But I had some other folks
I understand.
who are good. You know, they're like, man, if it's your birthday, I'm sending you a card. You know what I mean? And they say, do not take this case. And I said, well, why would you say that? And they said, well, because if you win, the cops are going to hate you. And if you lose, everybody else is going to. And so I'm like, My mother died March 2020 of COVID. And in that time, she was heavily on my mind. I can honestly say, as somebody who, you know, I'm one of 5 boys, we loved our mom. She was everything to us. But I had gotten beyond the grieving part. If you've ever lost a parent, the first month, you're just like, you don't know what to do. 6 weeks, 8 weeks, you begin to think about funny things they said and did. And they never they never leave you, but you begin to accept that you really just can't call mom up for the gumbo recipe anymore, you know? But I thought to myself, really, what would my mother expect of me? Mm-hmm. And I knew that I could not put my individual career considerations in front of what the moment called for, which is do the best you can with what you got. So what happens next is the governor calls and says, look, Mike can help, but I'm going to use my authority to appoint you to this case. Mm-hmm. You had 10 or 12 legislators writing him letters saying, we'll appoint Ellison. You had community groups saying the same thing, and the family saying the same thing.
So suddenly you weren't partnering, it became your case.
It was my case.
Yeah. And
yeah.
I want to stop you here just and read a very tiny portion of your book here. Because people need to understand, in history and in the way things work in society, there are occasionally moments where somebody has been thinking about something for a long time, and suddenly they find themselves in the middle of it. It becomes their experience. And so I'm just going to read just a paragraph or so here. It says, and it's describing previous incidents that some of which you were involved with as a lawyer trying to prosecute police violence, and this understanding that it doesn't usually result in a conviction, right? That it's a bad record of trying to address this issue. This is the wheel of policing in America that we're stuck in. It has been going on for more than 100 years. Civil rights leader Bayard Rustin once said, "The only weapon we have is our bodies, and we need to tuck them in places so the wheels don't turn." The wheel Rustin had in mind was the system of Jim Crow segregation, but it is connected to the wheel that spins between officer-involved deaths and inaction. They both spin along a cycle of injustice going round and round. 60 years after Rustin, haven't we seen that it's not enough to just stop the wheel? Isn't it time to actually break it? Isn't it time to get a new set of wheels that will roll toward liberty and justice for all? But we don't have that in the United States at this time. And on May 26, 2020, I was watching the wheel grind a man's face into the street.
Yeah.
This is the understanding that you brought to this case.
Yeah.
You were not just a state attorney general being asked to step in. You were somebody that had been wrestling with this for pretty much your whole life.
Absolutely. No question.
And it is chilling to think of that political reality and that societal reality. But it's also significant because, as you write about in the book, there's a tremendous pressure there. Because if you're going to actually try to break the wheel, you have to win.
You have to win. And in order to win, I never told myself that we had to win. The way to win is not to worry about winning.
Yeah, I understand.
It's just like the way to hit a home run is not to worry about hitting a home run. You just put the fat of the bat on the ball, step into it, and if you understand what I'm saying, you got to keep a laser beam focused on exactly the task right in front of you. And yeah, let me just say, the first investigative report in the wake of a catastrophic incident of officer-involved death on a civilian was the one in connection with the 1919 Chicago riot. Mm-hmm. This is when, the Lake Michigan was divided up, and there was a black section to swim in and a white section to swim in, and some black kid drifted over to the white section. Some ruffians started throwing stuff at him. He falls off and he drowns. Some black parents go to the police and say, these guys just did this horrible thing. What are you going to do about it? And the police turn on them, and next thing you know, it was a very catastrophic event for people in Chicago. University of Chicago later on does a whole report on it, comes up with recommendations, analysis, and the whole thing. But then in 1935 in Harlem, same thing happens. 1943, same thing happens.
In Detroit?
In Detroit,
Yeah.
and in right, Chicago, Harlem and Detroit in 43. Right. And then, more to come. By 1967, you have the Kerner Commission report, which is looking at over 2,000 or so tragic, explosive incidents that sparked between police and communities, mostly communities of color, almost overwhelmingly. And they write about this phenomena. But then it doesn't end in the 60s. What you get is the Christopher Report, which is what was written after the Rodney King incident, which reads almost the same as the Kerner Commission report and the Chicago report. And then even Obama sets up something called 21st Century Policing in the wake of Ferguson. This is a nationwide recurring problem which isn't really doing anybody any favors. I mean, as I mentioned before, I believe that bad police-community relationships are crimogenic in nature. They literally lead to more crime. I would say that if you look at it, the city of Minneapolis has paid $100 million in police misconduct civil rights judge settlements over the last 10 years. I guarantee you Chicago's paid 3 times that. New York has paid 3 times that. LA's paid 3 times that. I don't know how much Madison has paid, but I guarantee you it's more than anybody in this room thinks is a good use of money, right? And of course, these tragic incidents always erupt in civil unrest one way or another, and then they fracture the trust that is needed to reduce crime, as I mentioned. Here's another thing that bad police-community relations do. They lead to false convictions because they're often associated with overly aggressive interrogation tactics, which may lead to false convictions and then ultimate exonerations. So if you talk to the Innocence Project people, you go back, and usually that's at the heart of it. A classic example is what happened to the Central Park Five. And so this is bad for society. I just think that we have the system of impunity that I think I already mentioned, because there is this general unspoken fear that unless we let the status quo stay how it is, then we're going to be victimized by black criminals. And we don't say it, but we kind of, because it's not polite to say that, but we kind of, some people, I just think in general, we're willing to accept a few Derek Chauvins as long as it keeps me safe. And I'm telling you, it's not keeping anybody safe. In fact, it's making you more at risk.
And you had all of this understanding as you went into this case.
Yeah.
We're not going to go tonight through the whole case.
No.
That's because people can buy the book, and should. It is a gripping tale of the prosecution of Derek Chauvin and of an attorney general putting together a team of lawyers, many of them coming from the private sector, literally finding the smartest lawyers that you could find, some corporate types that you wouldn't expect to be in these positions.
Right. One of them is now a federal district court judge, but when I would see him normally, he would be on the other side of the table representing some Fortune 500 company that I was suing. And one day I just said to him, look, man, you got a nice house, you got a nice car, you bought some land over there, you're doing good. I hear you got a place in Malibu or something like that. Why don't you do something for the people? This guy, he was representing some corporate giant polluter. And I thought, well, if you could make them look, humane, then you certainly can do a lot with George Floyd, who was under a lot of assault on his person. I mean, in terms of like defamation, in my view. And this guy looked up in the air, and he said, "I'll do it."
It's incredible.
I said, "Well, how much you gonna charge me?" And then I folded my arms and said, just to brace myself, said nothing. And I'll get all my colleagues at my firm to help out. We had to waive some conflicts, but he was only working on this, and he ended up doing nothing short of a brilliant job. And some people saw him on TV, but a big part of the job he did was not on camera. A big part of it is just case strategy and doing and helping to pull together a narrative theme of the case. You all may remember. Did anybody watch the case through? Well, at the end, you'll see that this guy is doing a closing argument, and he says, many people have made a lot about George Floyd having an enlarged heart. Basically, they're saying his heart was too big, but the real problem is that Derek Chauvin's heart was too small. And I was like, wow. And when we did the rehearsal, he had that buried in the middle. I said, dude, that is a mic drop line. And we moved it to the back. But anyway, that's Judge Jerry Blackwell, who is sitting as a federal district court judge, Biden appointee, doing a great job. Yeah.
So you bring this team together, and as you kind of hint here, you don't brag very much about it, but you were running these meetings. You were bringing everybody in on a daily basis and saying, how are we going to approach this? What are we going to do? What was the toughest decision that you and this team had to make in the course of this trial?
The toughest decision, it's hard to say which was the toughest. I'll say it was very tough deciding who to assign what, because I had people on my staff who I believed in, who I trust and think are awesome, who wanted to do the closing or the opening, and I had to tell them no, because I'm one of them mean coaches who says best players play. And we actually did a mock jury, and where we paid some folks to listen to the existing evidence, and they rated all the presenters, and they would 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm like 1 and 2. Number one is doing the opening, number 2 is doing the first closing, and then you get rebuttal, and that and then number 1's going to do the jury selection, which is probably the most important part of the case. And then the other ones got good witnesses and they got good face time, but quite honestly, I was worried that I'd have a morale issue, because it's like you've picked these corporate guys over us, and I'm like, I love you, but we have a case to win, and I'm going to be pretty ruthless about that.
And one of the decisions that was made was to call a police chief.
Yes.
And that was, from the outside, and also from reading the book, that was a pretty dramatic choice.
Yes.
And maybe even a pivotal choice.
Yeah, so the police chief is an interesting guy. His name Madera Arredondo, African-American fellow. He has held every job in the police department there is to do. He was a patrol officer. He was a DARE officer. He was a sergeant. He was a lieutenant. He was a deputy chief. He had done every job. And in the course of his service as a Minneapolis police officer, he sued the Minneapolis Police Department for racial discrimination and won a settlement. Okay, and then he becomes the chief. So Madera is a guy who very loyal to his, very fiercely loyal if you're doing your job, but a real problem if you're not. And quite honestly, we called him because we wanted to signal to the jury that it was okay to convict this officer, because we were not, I mean, look, a lot of people on the progressive left didn't like this decision that I made, but I said we're not prosecuting policing. We're prosecuting Derek Chauvin. And a lot of people, we were all, just about everybody in this room, we all took DARE classes when we were in school. We watch, Law and Order on television. We watch Mod Squad. We watch 21 Jump Street. We watch cop opera. We watch, think about all the cop shows you've ever watched, right? Hill Street Blues. There's a lot. So we've been, and then even besides all that, if somebody breaks into your house, who are you going to call? Not Ghostbusters, right? So the bottom line is, it's not easy for your average person of any color to say, I'm going to find this police officer guilty. All doubts are resolved in favor of the officer in the eyes of the jury. So having the chief on as our witness was very important. And the chief gave permission to other officers. There was an officer by the name of Rich Zimmerman, who was the longest serving Minneapolis police officer. We called him because he was called to the scene. And he said, we don't train that. That is wrong. We called a woman named Katie Blackwell, who was a lieutenant in charge of training. That's wrong. We called a number of them. Some of them didn't want to come. And there's stories there too. But I've had some folks observe, after this being on camera and everything, of course, what else are they going to do? You'd be surprised what else they're going to do. I've seen folks say, no, we're sticking with our guy's a victim. No, we're not going to testify for the state against one of our members. Mm-hmm. But these folks came over, and the chief of police we subpoenaed him, so he had to come, but he was not reluctant to testify as to what he saw. In fact, he fired all three of them almost within 24 hours. Mm-hmm. And so this was good. One of the ways that we're going to break the wheel, folks, is we're going to have to empower the chief to do discipline and then hold the chief accountable for discipline. Now, you and I were talking about police unions before. The unions have gotten themselves involved in the disciplinary process. Now, look, I have no problem with the police union dealing with things like pay and pension and all that. Absolutely legitimate. But when the chief can't even fire an officer who has violated rules, now you have an ungovernable department, and it shows. So the chief being there was a very big deal, and it was not easy for him because he had some people who were piping hot mad at him for that.
Oh yeah, and. So you did all this, brought in these incredible lawyers, called witnesses, sometimes in risky took a chance on some of these witnesses, and they turned out to be powerful and have an impact. So then,
Well, one witness we called, if you don't mind me mentioning, was a woman was George Floyd's girlfriend.
yep,
And we called her because it was absolutely undeniable, and it was just there. It was a fact that George Floyd had some fentanyl and meth in his bloodstream. It was there. The fact that you have a problem with addiction does not mean that you are killable by the police at their whim. It doesn't mean that you don't have any rights. In fact, I believe that his drug abuse, if he was high, makes him more in need of assistance, right? And makes him more vulnerable. We brought his girlfriend in is because she explained, look, I got in a car accident and George had been a blue chip athlete, banged up, knees, all kinds of injuries, and he started taking, opioids. Then when he couldn't get any more prescriptions, started getting them on the street, and that's his story. And we needed to tell that story in a way that people would understand, because we knew that George Floyd, being 6'4", 220 pounds, very little fat, was somebody who some folks just would not be able to sympathize with, and would think that it was reasonable to treat him with that level of force because he's big, and let's be honest, he's African American, and there's this idea that African Americans don't suffer pain like white people do. People do believe that. There's a documented that some medical professionals believe that. And so we had to find a way to help sympathize. We couldn't act like the drugs weren't there, so we had to help people understand them. And they were understandable when you understand that a car accident or a sports injury might just land you in an addiction, as it did for Rush Limbaugh.
of all people.
Of all people.
You made George Floyd a son, a father, brother, human for the jury.
That's what we had to do.
And that is, when we talk about breaking the wheel, at core, that's a huge part of this, because
Yes.
juries and judges have to be brought out of 400 years of racism.
That's right.
They've got to be brought to a place where they can see a human being,
Right.
and see this case is real. And so you did all this, and then you come to that point where the jury's going to decide.
Yeah.
Were you scared at that moment before you knew the verdict?
I put it like this: we did not. We have to prepare to give the public information. We wrote 3 press statements at the end of this. We wrote one if Derek Chauvin was acquitted, if he won. We wrote one if he's convicted, if we won, and we wrote another if there was a split verdict. I was painfully aware that history was on Derek Chauvin's side, that if history was any barometer, then we were probably going to lose, and that we had to be prepared for that. I don't know if what I was feeling was fear, but I can tell you this: when we got the call that, well, first thing that's happened is that the Hennepin County Government Center is kind of like a toaster. I mean, there's buildings, there's offices and buildings and courtrooms on this side, offices and rooms and courtrooms on this side. There's bridges that connect the two, and in the middle, there's an open atrium, and you could look from the 21st floor all the way down to the fountain at the bottom. And so you could look out the window and see people. And at some point, we began to see all these folks scurrying around. And we're like, something's going on. And then we get the call from the court, verdict's in, and I'm like, uh-oh.
It came pretty quick.
It was the next day. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, here we go. And I could feel my heart palpably beating against my chest. Did you ever get that feeling? and I could feel it. And it's like, okay, and it was totally involuntary, but I could feel it. And I guess there was adrenaline pumping into my body at a very high rate. And I remember, and I've tried a lot of cases in the course of being a lawyer, and every single time I get the call from the court that the verdict's in, I start feeling this. And I don't feel it any other time. And it had been, I don't know, 14 years since I had tried a case, because I'd been in Congress for 12. We head down there, we, sit in those chairs, waiting for the verdict to come out. We thought it was only going to be, it must have only been around 7 or 8 minutes that we were waiting, but it felt like an hour to me. Finally, the jury starts filing out. The judge stands up and reads the verdict. Guilty, guilty, guilty. I was like, did I hear what I thought I heard? I was thinking about, could you read that again, Judge? And in trials, you can poll the jury. Mm-hmm. Jury number 1, what say you? Blam, blam, blam. And I'm like, wow. And I just felt stunned. I remember looking over at Derek Chauvin. And quite honestly, I never hated Derek Chauvin. Not only is it unprofessional to do that, he just seemed so small. And he seemed so ordinary. And I remember thinking like, man, your life's gonna change. Because he has a mom, he has a family, he has people who care about him. And people ask me, did Derek Chauvin commit a hate crime? We found no evidence that he was motivated by racial bias. You got to put a witness on. We didn't have one. And what I think what happened is that within the culture of that institution, that just kind of became the way things were done. Mm-hmm. And his fault is not that he's evil, but that he's a follower and didn't have the strength of character to challenge the norm. And sadly, he's suffering for it because he got 22 and a half years. And he might even feel like he was done an injustice not because he didn't do what he did, because he knows he did what he did. But he must have thought, well, what about all them other people who've done as much, if not worse than me? Mm-hmm. I wonder if he thought that. I don't know. But I know that that verdict day was something else.
And you say in the book that you didn't break the wheel.
No, we didn't break the wheel. Hopefully we cracked it. But I mean, we need social transformation. We need bigger changes than one case will bring. The big problem with this case is that some people will be like, well, okay, we convicted the bad guy. Back to business as usual, keep the wheels spinning. And yet, I feel that there have been some important changes. Not too long after that, the federal government prosecuted those guys, convicted. Mm-hmm. The people who murdered Ahmaud Arbery, convicted. The guys who just killed Tyree Nichols, they're charged and are probably going to be convicted, and now they're charged by the feds too. In Minnesota, we increased we reformed the police officer standards and training board, which confers licenses on police officers. It used to be that unless you were convicted, then you were under no license danger. But now it's like we don't care about the conviction, we care about the conduct. So if you as a police officer push your wife against a wall and you somehow manage to get her not to testify and the case has to be dropped, they're going to look at what happened. Did you do it or not? And so that's changed. And so we've banned certain chokeholds, banned other things, no-knock warrants. restricted the use of that. They're not banned, but the threshold has gone up. A lot of police departments are saying, we're going to use a drone. We're not just going to kick in the door and have guns blazing. We're going to use a drone. We're going to try to call the person out, right? And so there's a lot of, there are changes. Congress has not done anything. They failed to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. But I mean, I can tell that the changes, and what maybe the most important thing is people's perceptions have changed. A jury, a multiracial jury will convict if the facts support it. Whereas, in my opinion, I'm not sure Derek Chauvin would have even been charged, much less convicted in 1998. Going back to my earlier experience. Because my client, Lawrence Miles, was shot in the back. How could he possibly be posing a threat to somebody? But now I think jurors will say, they will listen. And I think that a lot of officers who are there to protect, who are there to guard, are more willing to speak out, thanks to Madera Arredondo and others. Do y'all ever heard of a woman named Carrie L. Horn? Can I tell them about Carrie L. Horn? Mm-hmm. Carrie L. Horn is a female police officer in the city of Buffalo. About 18 years ago, she and her partner went into a house to make an arrest. She cuffs her guy, walks him out. Her partner's still in the house, so she goes back in there to figure out what's going on. The guy is cuffed, the suspect is cuffed, but this guy is pounding on this guy, bashing him. Carrie L. intervenes and says, hey, you can't do that. The guy punches her, the cop, her colleague. She punches him back. And then they get separated. And she's like, you are in big trouble now. You abused somebody who was arrested in detention. You hit me. You're going to be in trouble. Well, somebody was in trouble. It was her. Then she ends up, losing her pension, all kinds of sad things like that. But meanwhile, that same officer who did this gets charged with a criminal civil rights violation and goes to jail for it. And meantime, George Floyd happens, she gets her pension restored, and she has a city ordinance passed in her honor called Carrie L's Law, which requires officers to intervene if they see wrongdoing by a fellow officer. So I got a lot of friends who are like, oh, I'm a police abolitionist. I say, I get that, but understand that rape, murder, and robbery does happen. Somebody's going to investigate that crime. Somebody. If not the police, who's going to do it? Let's figure out that. And if we actually just prosecuted crime, whether you had a badge or not, and we fired people for breaking administrative rules, and we trained people in a way that said, look, there's not your police academy training and then the training you get on the street. There's one training, only one. And if you don't do like everybody else who has a job and obey the rules, you ain't gonna be here. You would reduce this problem, you would increase clearance rates of crimes. Because people would start saying, I trust this institution, I'm going to share what I know. And there's a lot of other ways the things we can do to break the wheel, but I don't care how much, you will not ever train yourself out of a department that has a culture of impunity. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? If you have a custom of rule violation and law breaking, you can't train yourself out of that. Imagine taking Bob Kroll, remember the union president I was telling you all about? Imagine telling him he has to take racial sensitivity training class. He would sit in the back of the classroom, pull out his cell phone and play Candy Crunch till it's over and laugh about it and what a big stupid joke it all is. You cannot train. Training will work and be very effective if you start by saying, you do the right thing, you get rewarded. You do the wrong thing, and if it's wrong enough, we're going to prosecute you. And if it's just plain old wrong but not a crime, we're going to fire you, we're going to demote you, we're going to deny you promotions. But if you do the right thing and you protect and serve, then good. You're going to be the finest of our city, and we're going to lift you up. You do that, I guarantee you, you don't have to defund anything. You know, you're going to have a department you're proud of. It can happen. I mean, in Camden, New Jersey, they had a police department. Camden and Newark, New Jersey, had departments which were under federal consent decree because of the rampant, horrible problems that they had. They came in there, they made some serious changes. You had Ras Barak, who's the mayor of Newark. He got serious about it. And in 2021 and 2022, you didn't have a single officer-involved shooting in Newark, New Jersey. Amazing. So, I mean, it's not something that can't happen. And if you'll allow me, I'll just say that the problem is we have two uses of policing in America. Two of them. One of them is the legitimate investigation and protection against criminal conduct and victimization. Most everybody supports that. Everybody believes that that is a legitimate function. Then you also have another function. Let me ask you, let's see if we can figure out what it is. Who was it who arrested John Lewis when he was trying to cross Edmund Pettus Bridge? Who arrested Martin Luther King 30 times that he was arrested? Who arrested the Berrigan brothers when they were arrested? Police have been used to maintain social hierarchy. They have been. They arrest social dissidents, political dissidents, racial minorities, Native American people, women activists who don't act right. Remember, Stonewall started as a bad conflict between police and the gay community in New York. Socially disfavored people who got treated badly as the officers were trying to maintain a certain social hierarchy. And so that function is not legitimate, and yet it persists. We need to say this is an illegitimate use of police, and it must stop. And that's part of breaking the wheel too. And by the way, I'll say that it's not just policing that is used to maintain social hierarchy, so is education. So it's residential segregation. And there's a lot, and so is even our healthcare system. There are a number of ways we maintain vertical hierarchies in our society, and police is just one, but it often is the sharpest edge, and so it's what people see. So what we need to do is just call it out and understand that it's holding us back, it's not helping us, it's not making you safe, it's making you vulnerable, and it is within our power to break this wheel. Can I read something? If you think so.
I had this really good close for you there.
Sorry, go for
No,
it.
you got a little something you want to read, you can read it.
No.
You're
the expert.
They're supposed to go read it.
Okay.
We want them to go read it.
Y'all need to read it, yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you, I can't get in your heads, but I will tell you that I think the moment that Keith Ellison took over the George Floyd case will be seen 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, as a pivotal turning point in the struggle, the 400 and more year-long struggle of this country to deal with the fundamental challenges that we have as regards not just policing, but so many of the other deep divisions in this country. I feel very lucky to know you, but I also feel very lucky to have had this time tonight to talk about this. Ladies and gentlemen, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, the man who cracked the wheel and who is out to break the wheel. Please Join us outside in a couple minutes. He'll sign copies of his book. Thank you for coming out, and thank you, Keith Ellison, for joining us for Idea Fest.
Thanks, John.